Adolf Hitler League of Nations. Berlin, December 31st, 1933. Snow drifts across the rooftops, settling softly on swastika banners that hang from government buildings like frozen declarations of permanence. Church bells echo faintly through the cold night air. Beneath the winter calm, something irreversible has taken place. In less than 12 months, Hitler has dismantled the fragile machinery of German democracy, outlawing opposition, silencing dissent, consolidating power with ruthless precision. But tonight, the transformation no longer stops at Germany's borders. It reaches outward, toward Europe itself, and no one yet understands how far it will go. The Weimar Republic is already a memory. The Reichstag fire in February had provided the pretext. The Enabling Act in March had sealed its fate. Civil liberties vanished, political parties dissolved. Trade unions were crushed. By summer, Germany had become a one-party state. Yet dictatorship alone was not enough. Hitler needed legitimacy beyond terror. He needed a cause that resonated not just with fear but with pride. That cause was Versailles. To millions of Germans, the treaty signed in 1919 was not a peace settlement, but a humiliation. Territorial losses, military restrictions, war guilt, economic burden, the disarmament clauses, in particular, festered in the national imagination. Germany had been forced to reduce its army to 100,000 men. No tanks, no air force, severe naval limits. Meanwhile, the victorious powers had promised to disarm as well. They had not. On October 14, 1933, Hitler acted. Germany withdrew from the World Disarmament Conference in Geneva and from the League of Nations itself. The announcement was delivered not as aggression, but as protest. Germany, Hitler declared, sought equality of rights. If others would not disarm to Germany's level, then Germany would no longer remain bound. It sounded reasonable, it sounded principled. And that was precisely the danger, because beneath the language of fairness lay a far more radical intention. In Geneva, delegates reacted with shock, but not resolve. Britain expressed regret. France expressed concern. Speeches were delivered. Committees convened, but sanctions, none. Military response, unthinkable. The League had already suffered a wound earlier that year when Japan walked away after criticism of its actions in Manchuria. Now Germany followed. The institution meant to guarantee peace was losing its most powerful members and its authority along with them. The structure of collective security trembled, and yet no one moved to reinforce it. Though in Berlin, this hesitation was being carefully measured. Inside Germany, the withdrawal was orchestrated as a moment of national resurrection. Nazi propaganda framed it as liberation from foreign supervision. Crowds gathered, radio broadcasts echoed through homes and factories. The message was clear: Germany had stood up. Germany had spoken. Germany would no longer kneel. But isolation carries risks. Economic pressure, diplomatic retaliation, even war. Hitler understood this. He knew that stepping outside international oversight could provoke consequences. So before the world could react decisively, he prepared his next move, one that would transform a diplomatic gamble into a national mandate. Because in November, the German people themselves would be summoned to approve what had already been decided. And the result would echo far beyond Berlin. If you're drawn to immersive, deeply researched narratives that uncover the hinge moments of history, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps more viewers discover stories that shaped our world and ensures these critical lessons are never forgotten. By the end of 1933, the bridges to Geneva were burned. Germany stood apart from the very system designed to prevent another global catastrophe. To many abroad, it seemed a dramatic gesture, but perhaps not yet a threat. To Hitler, however, it was something else entirely: freedom. Freedom from oversight, freedom from restraint. Freedom to begin rebuilding power in ways Europe could not yet see. And as snow continued to fall over Berlin, the first pieces of a far larger design were quietly sliding into place. Joseph Goebbels' Nazi Party. Withdrawal from Geneva had been bold, but boldness alone was not security. Hitler understood something fundamental about power. Foreign defiance required domestic unity. If Germany was to stand apart from the international order, it could not appear divided at home. And so, in November 1933, the regime staged not merely an election, but a spectacle of national affirmation that would bind the German people to its course in a single, orchestrated gesture. Though beneath the pageantry lay a machinery of pressure few dared resist. On November 12th, one day after the anniversary of Germany's defeat in the First World War, citizens were called to the polls. The ballot asked a single, loaded question: did they approve Germany's withdrawal from the Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations? Simultaneously, a Reichstag election was held, though all opposition parties had already been banned. The outcome was predetermined, the purpose was symbolic. Weeks earlier, the groundwork had been laid. On October 4th, the editor's law placed the German press firmly under state control. Editors had to be Aryan. They were instructed daily on what could and could not be printed. Independent journalism vanished almost overnight. Newspapers became conduits of instruction rather than information. Radio broadcasts echoed identical themes: honor restored, sovereignty reclaimed, humiliation rejected. At the center of this transformation stood Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Propaganda. He understood that persuasion did not require truth. It required repetition, emotion, and spectacle. Rallies flooded city squares with banners and torchlight. Posters depicted Hitler, the embodiment of national destiny. The withdrawal from Geneva was framed not as a diplomatic maneuver, but as a moral reckoning. To vote yes was to vote for dignity. To vote no was to side with Versailles betrayal. The pressure was subtle and unmistakable. Ballots were cast publicly in many districts. SA and SS members observed polling stations. Neighbors could see who hesitated. In workplaces, party officials recorded participation. Abstention carried suspicion, dissent carried risk. The regime did not need universal terror. It needed visible conformity. And conformity was delivered with chilling efficiency. When the results were announced, they were overwhelming: 95.1% approval. Officially, over 40 million Germans had endorsed the withdrawal. International observers raised eyebrows. Manipulation was evident. Yet the figure achieved its purpose. It projected unanimity. It signaled to foreign governments that Hitler's course was not a reckless gamble, but the expressed will of the German people. The psychological impact was profound. Germany's isolation was no longer framed as imposed hardship, it was reframed as chosen destiny. The regime could now claim that its foreign policy carried democratic validation, however hollow the process had been. Internally, dissenters were further marginalized. If 95% supported the Führer, who would dare admit otherwise? This plebiscite did more than legitimize withdrawal. It fused nationalism with obedience. It blurred the boundary between leader and nation. Hitler was not merely governing Germany, he was personifying it. Criticism of policy became criticism of the people themselves. And beyond Germany's borders, the message was equally potent. Foreign diplomats could dismiss the vote as propaganda, but they could not ignore its symbolism. Confronting Hitler now meant confronting what appeared to be a united country. The cost of intervention seemed higher, the risk of escalation more unpredictable. If you value deeply immersive historical storytelling that examines not just events but the psychology behind them, consider subscribing and liking this video. Your support ensures that more viewers can engage with the moments that shaped the modern world and the warning signs history left behind. By late November 1933, Hitler had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed a potentially destabilizing diplomatic rupture into a demonstration of strength. Germany appeared unified, resolute, defiant. The League's authority diminished further. The democracies hesitated still. But unity, once manufactured, demands direction. And in December, that direction would take a decisive turn away from diplomacy and toward preparation. With the plebiscite behind him, Hitler's government no longer had to justify its actions only to execute them. By December 1933, the machinery of isolation was repurposed as preparation. The Reichsbank, under Gerhard, took decisive steps that would quietly reshape Germany's economic and military trajectory. Foreign creditors were notified that hard currency payments on loans would be reduced, signaling a breach of international financial confidence. But Schacht did not mismanage resources. Scarce foreign exchange was redirected toward raw materials essential for rearmament. The foundation for Germany's future military expansion was being laid, not through open confrontation, but through calculated economic strategy. Domestic conformity deepened alongside economic maneuvering. The Winter Relief Campaign, which ostensibly collected charity for the needy, became a subtle instrument of social control. Donations were not merely acts of goodwill, they were acts of loyalty. Unemployment statistics were carefully adjusted, and women were statistically removed from the workforce to present an illusion of full employment. Propaganda reinforced a narrative in which isolation was synonymous with strength, defiance with dignity, and unity with prosperity. To be German under Hitler's vision was to embrace these axioms wholeheartedly. Meanwhile, the world watched cautiously, still unsure of the implications. European powers debated sanctions and condemnations, but ultimately lacked the cohesion and will to act decisively. Germany's withdrawal, its plebiscite, and its economic maneuvers were interpreted as posturing, perhaps dangerous, yet insufficiently threatening to provoke confrontation. Hitler understood the miscalculation. Freed from external oversight, insulated by national pride, and shielded by global distraction, Germany could now prepare for the ambitions that had once seemed impossible. Every strategic decision reinforced the regime's myth. Hitler was no longer just a domestic dictator. He had become a statesman defying the world. His image radiated invincibility at home, while abroad he was treated as a cautionary figure rather than an imminent threat. The groundwork was laid not merely for rearmament, but for the psychological conditioning of a nation. Citizens internalized obedience and pride, seeing international isolation as moral vindication. This was a society prepared for conflict, its preparation invisible to those still clinging to the hope of diplomacy. December 31st arrived with the hush of falling snow. Berlin was tranquil on the surface, yet beneath the quiet streets, the machinery of future war was humming. Factories silently shifted to armaments production. Military planners finalized secret programs. The Reichsbank's decisions ensured that resources were available when the time came to act openly. The German people, bound by ideology and ritual, were unknowingly aligned with a regime that had moved from defiance to readiness with remarkable speed. The closing days of 1933 left Europe in a fragile equilibrium. Diplomats exchanged cautious notes, journalists speculated, and historians would later marvel at the understated brilliance of the Nazi strategy. In reality, Germany had transformed isolation into opportunity. Free from collective oversight, energized by manufactured unity, and armed with redirected economic power, the stage for future expansion was set. And yet, most contemporaries failed to recognize the implications until it was too late. As the year ended, the lesson was clear: power is not merely seized, it is prepared. The withdrawal from Geneva was no theatrical protest. It was the opening act of a larger, inevitable narrative, one that would sweep across Europe with devastating consequence. Germany stood alone, yes, but stronger than anyone imagined. Its people unified, its economy focused, its ambitions clear. The pre-war era was quietly returning, and the world had barely noticed.